Hi, I'm Peter J. Ray. Welcome to Adventures in History. Today's topic is Ulysses S. Grant. Part 10, elected 18th U.S. President in 1868. We stopped last time in 1869. Ulysses S. Grant took office as the 18th President in March 1869. And his dear wife, Julia, was the First Lady. She was very outgoing, loved gatherings and get-togethers, and so the White House became the center of the social scene in Washington, D.C. Women's suffrage, the vote for women, was a popular issue. American women could not vote at that time. After eating dinner on a daily basis, Grant enjoyed wandering across Lafayette Square to visit the house of Hamilton Fish, the Secretary of State. There were many formal dinners, and Grant became portly, gained weight. His beard was flecked with gray. He enjoyed the company of wealthy businessmen. At state dinners, alcohol flowed freely, but Grant did not drink. President Grant adorned the public parks of Washington, D.C. with trees and shrubbery. He straightened one-third of the city streets and installed sidewalks and streetlights. He worked to finish the Washington Monument, which was still a stub. Julia in the White House put in new wallpaper and carpets. Grant put in a billiard room at the White House. He removed the Thomas Jefferson statue from the north lawn from the White House and moved that to Statuary Hall at the Capitol. Julia cleared the south lawn of public loungers and turned that into a beautiful lawn. Julia said about the White House years, quote, 8 happy years I spent there, so happy. Prince Arthur, the third son of Queen Victoria of Great Britain, visited, and a 29-course dinner was served. Grant had hired an army chef who liked to prepare heavy slabs of roast beef with cheese piled on an apple pie. Julia fired him and hired Italian cook Valentino Mella, who served meals with 35 dishes, with new wine for every third dish. Grant was an active man. He felt cooped up at the White House. He would work from 10 a.m. to 3 p.m. and then escape with a carriage ride with Julia with speedy trotters, horses. It was too fast. They were too fast for Julia, who would beg to return to the White House. Grant enjoyed solitary walks in Washington, D.C. He would go for 5 or 6 miles and often see Walt Whitman. They would salute each other. On May 19th, President Grant issued a proclamation calling for an 8-hour workday for government workers. Grant and Sherman attended the West Point graduation in 1869. They attended a ball. Both were poor dancers. Grant danced like a frozen toad turkey. Sherman took steps like his soldiers marching to the sea. The New York Times recorded that both men, quote, deserted the Terpsichorean field. Not everyone that shone at Waterloo cut a fine figure at the Brussels ball the night before. Grant enjoyed in summers spending time in Long Branch, New Jersey. There he enjoyed the sea breeze, beautiful villages, and the hospitable people. Grant would show feats of strength by doing 25 to 30 chin-ups. At Long Branch, they stayed in a beach house, a sanctuary from the pressures of the White House. His children, Fred was the oldest at 18, Jesse was 11, the youngest. They were a happy family. At meals, Grant would form bread into small balls and throw them at his children, Nellie and Jesse. He was playful. His son, Fred, was at West Point. His second son, Buck, was strong, simple, and straightforward. Nettie was pretty, sweet, and pampered. Jesse was energetic and loved ponies and he would go for walks with his father. They would talk and gaze at the stars. Jesse enjoyed collecting stamps and had pets and played baseball. Jesse sent $5 to a Boston company for stamps and received nothing. Grant asked a Washington, D.C. policeman, Kelly, to write on White House stationery, quote, I am a Capitol policeman. I can arrest anybody, anywhere, at any time for anything. I want you to send those stamps to Jesse Grant right at once. Jesse received the stamps. Julia could detect treacherous people around Grant, and she soothed Grant when cares oppressed him. Adam Badeau was his secretary. Grant adored Julia. Grant and Julia would walk arm in arm each morning to breakfast, and then at nighttime for dinner. His mission was to preserve the Union and safeguard the freedmen. On March 19th, President Grant signed a bill calling for equal rights for black people in Washington, D.C. From January to March of 1870, Virginia, Mississippi, and Texas returned to the Union, pledging to protect black rights. In Mississippi, there was a black majority. It was a furnace of violence. Maine-born Governor Adelbert A. Ames was commander of the 4th Military District. Ames was among the carpetbaggers bringing Northern liberty to the South. The black codes were worse than slavery. Ames wanted to protect the freed men. He was fighting the violence and white power structure of Mississippi. In 1867, the Bureau of Education had been created to educate the freedmen. Congress cut its budget in 1869. President Grant fought to save that budget. In May of 1869, Robert E. Lee came to the White House to discuss a railroad venture with Ulysses S. Grant. Grant was joking around and said, quote, "You and I, General, have had more to do with destroying railroads than building them." Lee was serious and not interested in joking. It was the last time Grant and Lee met. Robert E. Lee died October 12, 1870. On April 13th, General Ellie Parker, a Seneca Indian, Grant appointed him as Commissioner of Indian Affairs. He became the first Indian and non-white person to hold that post. There were 300,000 American Indians. The Indians had moved off the Great Plains where they hunted buffalo. There was corruption in the Indian Affairs Department. Government traders were cheating the Indians out of the food, clothes, and shelter they were entitled to under the treaties with the government. Grant vowed to clean it up. He asked Quakers to become Indian agents. Grant wanted Quakers and honest Army officers as Indian agents. This led to conflict with Congress. U.S. Army was at war with the Indians. Phil Sheridan had said, quote, "The only good Indians I know are dead." Grant had sympathy for underdogs, and that included American Indians. In the Indian Wars in the West, there were atrocities from both sides. Grant supported putting Indians on large reservations. The white men were killing the buffalo on the Great Plains, and that doomed the Indian way of life. January of 1870, the U.S. cavalry under Major Eugene M. Baker massacred 173 Piegan Blackfeet in the Montana Territory, mostly women, children, and the elderly. They were roasted alive in teepees, burned to death. As a result, military officers were banned from becoming Indian agents. Grant supported religious people becoming Indian agents, hoping they would do a better job and work for the welfare of Indians. President Grant wanted the United States to annex what is now the Dominican Republic, the eastern two-thirds of the island of Hispaniola, which it shares with Haiti. At that time, it was called Santo Domingo. Colonel Joseph Fabens, from a New England speculator, reported that Santo Domingo is rich in mineral, agricultural, and timber resources. Hamilton Fish, the Secretary of State, opposed annexing Santo Domingo. Grant liked Samana Bay in Santo Domingo as a coal station for naval ships. Santo Domingo had become independent from Spain in 1865. Grant wanted the United States to annex what's now the Dominican Republic, and he said, quote, "It is an island of unequaled fertility. The highlands are suited to coffee, the lowlands to sugar. With the acquisition of San Domingo, the two great necessities of every family, sugar and coffee, would be cheapened by 1/2. Grant said that black Americans could move to Santo Domingo if they were fed up with abuse in the United States. 1,000 black Americans had already moved to Liberia and West Africa in 1866 and 1867. There was opposition to the United States taking what's now the Dominican Republic. The people there spoke Spanish and were of African descent. They were Catholic and had Roman Catholic Christian and had no tradition of democracy. In July, Grant sent Colonel Orville Babcock to look at Samana Bay. On September 4th, Babcock signed a treaty with the Santo Domingo president Buenaventura Baez, in which the United States would annex Santo Domingo. It would become a U.S. territory and then eventually a state. Grant supported that treaty. However, there was opposition in his cabinet and opposition in Congress and public opinion. Charles Sumner, the leader of the Senate, opposed that treaty. In Cuba, there was a rebellion against Spain, fighting for independence. John Rawlins wanted the U.S. to support that rebellion, and he wanted the United States to annex Cuba. Northerners wanted to end Spanish rule and slavery in Cuba. Grant wanted to support the rebels. Hamilton Fish did not want war with Spain. There was conflict between Rawlins and Fish. In June, 2 Americans were executed in Cuba for their involvement in the rebellion. Grant did not support the rebels. He wanted to avoid war with Spain. President Grant hoped the United States could buy Cuba. However, public opinion in Spain was against the United States and did not support selling Cuba to the U.S. John Rawlins was dying. He was popular. Generals came to visit, including Ellie Parker, William T. Sherman, and Montgomery Meigs. Grant became guardian for Rawlins' 3 children and wife. On September 6th, Rawlins died. Grant was out of town and returned 1 hour late. With the death of Rawlins, there was public grief for that man who had become the war secretary and had been such a big help for Ulysses S. Grant for many years. After the death of Rawlins, William Tecumseh Sherman became acting Secretary of War, and then Grant named William W. Belknap. Grant missed Rawlins. There was no one to protect Grant from the crafty, cynical politicians. Grant became the guardian for Rawlins' children. He financially supported them and helped them get jobs. 2 of Wall Street's most conniving moguls, Jay Gould and James Fisk Jr., wanted to make money from the gold market. They had a campaign to pressure President Grant to reduce gold sales in their scheme in the Treasury Department. They argued that this would help American exports. Abel Rathbone Corbin was married to Grant's sister Virginia and was part of the scheme. Corbin said to Grant that there were benefits to high gold prices. The assistant treasurer for New York, Major General Daniel Butterfield, Grant had appointed from the influence of Corbin and Gould. Gould made a $10,000 bribe to Butterfield to support the gold plot. In June, Grant visited his son Fred at West Point. He also visited Corbin in New York City. Jay Gould also visited them. Grant accepted the offer to travel to Boston on Fisk's steamboat. In September, the gold price collapsed from $160 to $133 a pound. The stock market fell 20%. It was an economic calamity. Gould, Fisk, and Grant were blamed. Henry Adams, the grandson of John Quincy Adams, became the strongest critic of President Grant. He wanted a government job and didn't get one. Grant didn't like the Adams family clan. He thought they were elitist. Henry Adams had this to say about a December 1869 White House reception, quote, "At last Mrs. Grant strolled in. She squints like an isosceles triangle, but is more vulgar than some duchesses. Her sense of dignity did not allow her to talk to me, but occasionally she condescended to throw me a constrained remark." Henry Adams said that Grant defeated Darwin's evolution theory and said, quote, "The progress of evolution from George Washington to Ulysses S. Grant was alone evidence enough to upset Charles Darwin." President Grant had a major conflict with Senator Charles Sumner. Sumner had been anti-slavery. He was famously beaten by South Carolina Representative Preston Brooks on the Senate floor. Sumner expected to dominate Grant's foreign policy. Sumner in the Senate was arrogant and imperious. He wanted the Secretary of State position, but failed to get it. He succeeded in having John Lothrop Motley assigned as minister to England. Hamilton Fish had this to say about Charles Sumner, quote, "Charles Sumner is bitterly vindictive and hostile. He is determined to oppose and, if possible, to defeat everything that the president proposes or wishes or does. I am convinced that he is crazy. Vanity, conceit, and ambition have disturbed the equilibrium of his mind. He is irrational and illogical. No mad bull ever dashed more violently at a red flag than he does at anything that he thinks the president is interested in." President Grant said this about Charles Sumner, quote, "Charles Sumner has been unreasonable, cowardly, slanderous, unblushingly false. He has not the manliness ever to admit an error. I feel greater contempt for him than for any other man in the Senate." Now, one of the issues was the Confederate ship Alabama that the British had built. It destroyed Union ships and prolonged the Civil War. The British supplied the Confederates with torpedoes and guns. President Andrew Johnson had signed a treaty with Great Britain in which the U.S. received small compensation. The public was angry about it. Charles Sumner gave a speech in the Senate, and he said the United States wanted $2 billion in compensation and Canada. Grant feared war with Great Britain. He was pro-British. This was part of the ongoing conflict between Grant and Sumner. Grant wanted to support black Americans, and he was doing so. On December 11th, he received a delegation of the mostly black National Labor Convention. On November 30th, Mississippi and Texas voted for new state constitutions, which provided for black rights, and they were readmitted to the Union. In Mississippi, new Senator Hiram Reeves became the first black in the Senate. He occupied the seat held by Jefferson Davis. The 13th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution abolished slavery. The 14th Amendment gave black people citizenship, and the 15th gave black people the right to vote, at least black men. Grant believed that the ballot was the only way for black people in the South to defend their lives, property, and rights. Southern blacks became lieutenant governors, militia officers, state legislators, secretaries of state, coroners, constables, and judges. There were 600 black legislators in the South during Reconstruction, and they held 20% of the state political offices. 13% of the population of the U.S. was black, 36% in the South, and they had a majority in Mississippi and South Carolina. There was an effort in Georgia and throughout the South to strip black people of the vote by having a poll tax and registration with onerous requirements. Republicans were losing their popularity over the issue of supporting the black vote in the South. On November 20th, 1869, Grant nominated Edwin Stanton for the Supreme Court. The Senate confirmed him. Stanton died days later of heart failure at age 55. Grant named two members to the Supreme Court, Joseph P. Bradley and William Strong. In 1869, the U.S. population was 40 million people. There was an industrial boom and westward expansion. President Grant proposed a survey of the Isthmus of Darien in Central America for a possible canal there. Grant gave in his December message, he said that the freedmen were making progress in education and labor, and he had a treaty with Santo Domingo. It was pending. 50-year lease at Samana Bay and annexation. February of 1870, there was a vote regarding the Santo Domingo. The people there voted whether they supported annexation. And in the population of Santo Domingo, 15,169 voted in favor. Only 11 voted against it. And President Baez, in what's now the Dominican Republic, used bully tactics to get that result. January 2nd, 1870, President Grant visited Charles Sumner in his home. Sumner's friend James M. Ashley was being ousted as governor of the Montana Territory. He wanted President Grant's help in retaining him. Grant refused, and Sumner was angry. Ongoing conflict between Ulysses S. Grant and Charles Sumner. January 10th, Grant sent the Santo Domingo Treaty to the Senate. The Senate Foreign Relations Committee voted no. Grant persevered in the lost cause for the Santo Domingo annexation. Grant refused to appease Sumner for patronage. Carl Schurz said that the people of Santo Domingo were lazy, shiftless, and tropical. John Logan said that Santo Domingo people were naked and half savages. Grant said that the population of Santo Domingo is 120,000 people, and that the land that the 2/3 of the island could support 10 million people. He called it a paradise with rich soil and good harbors. In June, Grant's he had conflict in his cabinet regarding the Santo Domingo annexation treaty. On June 27th, Ohio Governor Rutherford B. Hayes visited Grant at the White House. They commiserated about the Santo Domingo Treaty and Grant's conflict with Sumner. On June 30th, the Senate voted to reject the Santo Domingo Treaty. This was a defeat for President Grant. Attorney General Ebenezer Hoar, an ally of Sumner, did not support annexation of Santo Domingo. On June 15th, Grant asked for Hoar's resignation. He replaced him with Amos T. Ackerman of Georgia, who was honest and supported blacks voting in the South and black rights in Georgia. Congress created the Department of Justice to support black rights in the South and fight the Ku Klux Klan. The Klan was terrorizing blacks and trying to take their guns away and stop them from voting and going to school. Blacks in the South were being reduced to near slavery. Governors in the South were asking President Grant for help. March of 1870, North Carolina Governor William Holden reported that the Klan was terrorizing black people there and asked President Grant for help. Grant sent troops to North Carolina. The district attorney in Mississippi case said that the five main witnesses in a case were murdered. Witnesses to crimes against blacks feared death if they testified. In elections in the South, the Klan intimidated black voters and tried to keep them from voting. The Klan wanted a submissive black workforce. South Carolina Governor Robert K. Scott reported that blacks were murdered for expressing political opinions. In 1870, President Grant met Indian leaders Red Cloud and Spotted Tail at the White House. There was pomp and ceremony that was reserved for heads of state, as President Grant showed respect for them. Red Cloud was from the Oglala Sioux and had wanted to meet with Grant at the White House. They were talking about the possibility of the Indians going to a reservation. Red Cloud said to President Grant, quote, "Our nation is melting away like the snow on the side of the hills where the sun is warm, while your people are like the blades of grass in the spring when summer is coming." Red Cloud, the Indian Red Cloud, went to the Cooper Union in New York City in June and gave a speech there to a packed, spellbound audience and said, quote, "The riches we have in this world," Secretary Cox said, "truly we cannot take with us in the next world. Then I want to know why agents are sent to us who do nothing but rob us and get the riches of this world away from us." Peace with Red Cloud and the Oglala Sioux were major achievements for President Grant. In the Southwest, Major General Oliver Otis Howard rode unarmed to the Dragoon Mountains of Arizona and met with Cochise, the chief of the Chiricahuan Apache people, and convinced them to move to reservations. General George Crook was the greatest humanitarian general. The Modoc Indians in California were fighting Indians. They were fighting the U.S. Army. Captain Jack was the Modoc chief. January of 1873, Grant told Sherman to stop the fighting and negotiate a settlement with the Modoc Indians. On April 11th, during 1873, during negotiations, the Indians shot and killed Major General Edward Canby and the Reverend Eleazar Thomas. Captain Jack and others were captured, tried, convicted, and executed. Grant was firm in having peace with Indians. In 1874, the southern Great Plains erupted. The Kiowa, Comanche, Cheyenne, and Arapaho Indians went on the warpath. In 1875, Indian leaders from those nations were arrested, 74 of them, and shipped to prison in St. Augustine, Florida. October of 1870, Grant wrote to Santo Domingo President Baez that he reassured him he was pursuing the issue of annexation of Santo Domingo with Congress. However, it was hopeless. Grant requested that Congress send a 3-man commission to travel to what's now the Dominican Republic to investigate. On December 21st, Charles Sumner gave a speech against the Santo Domingo Treaty. He referred to Ahab, his wife Jezebel, who were stoned to death by Naboth, from the story from the Bible. Hamilton Fish said that Sumner was a crazy monomaniac. Sumner said about Grant, he called him, quote, "a colossus of ignorance." Fighting the Ku Klux Klan was like a new civil war. The former abolitionists had a new cause in fighting the Ku Klux Klan. Grant wanted to win this new war. He was swamped with letters from the South describing the nightmare that blacks and white Republicans were going through. Grant determined to protect blacks in the South. The Justice Department was helping. Violence in the South led to Democratic victories in which Republicans were afraid to vote, white and black. May of 1870, Congress passed the Enforcement Act. This protected the vote and voting rights of blacks in the South, which had been granted by the 15th Amendment. In February of 1871, under the Enforcement Act, there was federal oversight of elections in the South. Federal judges were appointed election officials. There was a need to destroy the Ku Klux Klan. In South Carolina, black people were fleeing their homes at night and going to the woods for safety. The South Carolina government was powerless to preserve law and order and requested federal help. President Grant sent troops to South Carolina. Grant sought an anti-Ku Klux Klan law. James Garfield of Ohio opposed that and said an anti-Klan bill meant the abolition of state governments. On April 20th, 1871, Grant signed the Third Enforcement Act, which was also called the Ku Klux Klan Act. This gave President Grant the right to suspend habeas corpus and declare martial law in parts of the South and send troops south, and also break up and disperse, quote, bands of disguised marauders. This was war against the Ku Klux Klan. The Ku Klux Klan threatened the victory achieved in the Civil War. In November, there were 2,000 Klan arrests in South Carolina. The federal grand juries made 3,400 indictments, and there were 1,100 convictions. Frederick Douglass supported President Grant. He was angry with Sumner, who lumped Grant with Franklin Pierce, James Buchanan, and Andrew Johnson. Sumner had given traditional support for black rights, but he was against the Santo Domingo annexation because he was racist. Congress passed a joint resolution in which a three-man commission was sent to investigate Santo Domingo annexation. Frederick Douglass was the secretary. The commission went, and their report was very positive on about their beliefs that bringing Santo Domingo, what's now the Dominican Republic, into the U.S. The conflict between Hamilton Fish and Charles Sumner continued. Sumner called Fish Mephistopheles. Now, Mephistopheles was a devil in medieval legend who sold his soul for knowledge and power. Fish said that Sumner was mentally deranged. There were efforts in the Senate to oust Sumner as chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee, and in a vote, Sumner was deposed. Grant said, quote, Charles Sumner has abused me in a way I have never suffered from any other man living. Grant was worried that the conflict with Sumner would lead to a Republican schism in 1872. The commission to Santo Domingo returned to the U.S. in March, supporting annexation. Sumner said that the despotic Santo Domingo was a threat to Republican Haiti. Frederick Douglass said that Santo Domingo was superior to Haiti, that the Haitian government was despotic. Douglass said that the U.S. should annex Santo Domingo. This would be a blow against tropical slavery and promote black people. The U.S. public was opposed to the Santo Domingo Treaty. President Grant's conflict with Charles Sumner continued. The Santo Domingo Annexation Treaty failed, and the conflict with Sumner was a major factor. Grant refused to defer to Sumner. Now, with Sumner out as the head of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, it was easier to settle the Alabama claims against Great Britain. Grant was pro-British. He said that the U.S. and the UK were the most free people in the world. In communications between the United States and Great Britain, there was an agreement that there would be a joint commission created to arbitrate the conflict over the Alabama claims. Charles Sumner wanted Canada and the Great Britain out of the Western Hemisphere, including the Caribbean, Bahamas, Jamaica, Trinidad, Guyana, Bermuda, the Falkland Islands, all British colonies. This was unreasonable. A commission was established. The British expressed regret. This was progress. It was recommended to create a 5-man arbitration tribunal and to meet in Geneva, Switzerland. And the 5 people would be chosen by 5 individuals, including Grant would choose one, Queen Victoria another, the King of Italy, the President of Switzerland, and the Emperor of Brazil. And then that arbitration team would decide on what was a just compensation for the Alabama claims. After this, there was a celebration with strawberries and ice cream. The U.S. public supported arbitration. The Senate voted to approve on May 24th. This led to a precedent for international disputes. President Grant was liberated from Charles Sumner. On August 1st, Hamilton Fish said he wanted to resign. Grant said he needed Fish and pressured him to stay, which he did. Charles Francis Adams Sr. was appointed to the American Tribunal. Hamilton Fish was a big help for President Grant. Grant was firm in the need for compensation from the Alabama claims. There's a Thomas Nast drawing that said, no more concessions. Now, the tribunal's verdict was that the UK would pay the United States $15.5 million. This was a successful resolution. It was the value of international arbitration and a major victory for President Ulysses S. Grant. Grant's administration was considered corrupt. Grant was honest. He was unable to believe that subordinates were corrupt. He was trusting. He defended friends in their scandals. The sources of corruption were the Civil War expansion of government, industry, big business, political machines, the dominance of the Republican Party, the post-war economic boom, and the universal desire for wealth. One of the issues of the time was civil service reform. Government jobs were based on connections rather than merit. Grant made an effort for civil service reform. He created the Civil Service Commission. This involved having exams, the end of forced payments by political and civil servants. This effort failed. Congress did not support. There was pressure from politicians, and the public wasn't interested. Grant believed that political appointments were necessary for American politics as they existed at that time. It was called the spoils system. President Lincoln was praised as a master politician. Grant was blamed as being corrupt. It was a double standard. The powers in the Senate were Roscoe Conkling of New York, Oliver Morton of Indiana, Zachariah Chandler of Michigan, and Simon Cameron of Pennsylvania. The Republican Party had become powerful. This had led to corruption. Roscoe Conkling of New York was a Grant ally. He was powerful, and Grant needed his support. Grant gave Conkling control of the New York Customs House, involving 1,500 jobs and customs revenue and an opportunity for corruption. July of 1870, President Grant nominated Thomas Murphy to be the New York Customs Collector. In 1871, Murphy left office in a scandal and was replaced by Conkling henchman Chester A. Arthur, who later became president. The most distressing corruption case for Grant was L.A. Parker, Commissioner of Indian Affairs. On July 13, Parker resigned. There were swindling agents who were fleecing Indians. Grant was sympathetic to the Indians' plight. It was hard to be just to the Indians and protect the railroad and white settlers. In May 1872, Grant met with Red Cloud and Red Dog and other Oglala Sioux chieftains. Grant told them about the growing U.S. population. Grant said that the end of the Indian hunting grounds, the Indians needed new modes of living. Grant agreed to send the Oglala Sioux large herds of cattle and sheep. There was the destruction of their traditional culture based on the buffalo. On March 1st, 1872, President Grant established Yellowstone as the first national park. In 1872, the Klan had been smashed in the South. Republicans felt safe in the South. Frederick Douglass said that peace had come and that the slaughter had ceased. This was a victory for President Grant, a major victory. Attorney General Ackerman was in conflict with a railroad company. Grant was under political pressure and asked Ackerman to resign. The new Attorney General was George H. Williams. Well, that concludes today's presentation. Thanks so much for watching. Really appreciate it. God bless you. Take care, and I'll see you next time.